Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar of 2017 titled Phase 4 Core Certification Pioneers. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. I'd like to mention a few logistical items. You will be able to download a copy of today's presentation from the caqh.org website tomorrow. In addition, a copy of the slides and webinar recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. We will save time at the end of today's program dedicated to responding to your questions. You're encouraged to submit your questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. During this webinar, we will spend some time on the Phase 4 operating rule requirements, as well as on voluntary core certification. After that, we will have a panel conversation with our Phase 4 pioneers, talking to them about their Phase 4 certification experience. I would like to thank our guest panelists for joining us today. We have Amy Peterson and Lisa Savacki from Humana, Faye Bienen from PocketDoc, and Jennifer Jones from WorkCom PDI. I will formally introduce them a little later, but wanted to extend our appreciation to all of them. So let's get started. I would like to introduce our first speaker, CAQH Core Director, Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great, thanks, Jessica. And just as Jessica mentioned, we do want to provide a little bit of a background on the operating rules for this particular phase, kind of what the scope of those are, then go into a little bit of the details associated with each of the rules that governs the different transactions that make up this phase. So on the next slide, you'll see that Phase 4 really is the continuation of the operating rules for each of the HIPAA-mandated transactions. So for phases 1, 2, and 3, the transactions as well as the operating rules are mandated by HHS for adoption and use by all HIPAA-covered entities. These include the eligibility transaction, claim status, the EFT, and the ERA. Now at Phase 4, as the HHS designated operating rule author, we have drafted and published this set of Phase 4 operating rules for another 4 transactions: the healthcare claim, the prior authorization or referral and certification transaction, the enrollment disenrollment transaction, as well as the health claim premium payment transaction. And today, these are still voluntary. HHS has recommended their adoption. Has recommended their adoption by the industry, but has not yet mandated their use. But Phase 4 does have a lot of potential benefits that we'll talk about in just a moment. But again, we want to move on to the next slide where we have just a scope and overview of the particular requirements for each of these transactions. And the transactions requirements fall into different categories. We have how the transaction is processed or processing mode. And that could be in potential real-time or batch, for example. We also have acknowledgments for batch transactions and real-time transactions. We also have very specific requirements for our connectivity and security for the transactions, and also system availability and companion guide template requirements. There are also some very particular transactions for the specific transactions, and we'll go into a little bit of detail of those in some of the subsequent slides. But it gives you an overview that we look at how the transactions are being conducted between trading partners, including from the health plan to the provider or from the provider to the health plan, as well as ensuring that the systems are available and ready, and that the communication, all of this infrastructure is built up for a systematic, a national-wide system to conduct the transaction. On the next slide, we'll move into some of our detailed requirements, and we'll talk first about our batch requirements, and this is related to the processing mode, response times, and the acknowledgement requirements. And basically, for many of the transactions, particularly the 837, the 834, and the 820, batch is required to be supported. This is pretty broadly adopted in the industry as a general mode for processing these larger transactions. For the 278, for the prior authorization transaction, the entities have the option to offer batch or real time, so that's why you see that note there. But again, the detailed requirement is more around if the batch is sent in before 9 p.m., the responses are available by 7 a.m. the next morning, so that when the office staff comes into the office, they'll know exactly if the claims were accepted, if the transactions were processed, and therefore they can work through any sort of rejects or rebilling that they may have to do. So again, the acknowledgments for batch are specific to the 999 transaction, which is the next 12 transaction that confirms receipt of the batch, as well as can let you know if it was accepted with errors or rejected. So again, maybe you've submitted a batch of claims, the batch was rejected by the clearinghouse would send that 999 to ensure that you know that you need to rework that batch to resubmit it. And knowing that within a few hours is really helpful. Also for the claim, we do have the requirement for the use of the 277CA, or the claim acknowledgement transaction. And this transaction, again, is specific to the claim, ensures that providers receive information about any sort of front-end edits that may have rejected the claim. So the batch was accepted, the claim goes through the front-end edits. The health plans can reject claims at that level, and ensuring that the provider gets that transaction ensures that they can rework those and rebill those pretty much immediately, so that they don't have to wait around for all the way to the remittance advice to come, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month later to process those, to reprocess those claims. So again, the requirements around the processing mode for batch are really important and key for these types of transactions. If we move to the next slide, we also have requirements for real-time processing mode. Again, not required to be offered, but if you do offer real-time for these transactions, there are very specific requirements around how to process transactions in the real-time mode. It includes a 20-second real-time maximum trip for when the provider sends a transaction potentially, and when the receipt of the acknowledgement is required. So again, the requirements for the acknowledgements are the same, the 999 for all the transactions, and the use of the 277CA for the claims transaction. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see some of the details related to the system availability requirements. And this ensures that the systems that the transactions flow across are up and available to make sure that the providers have the timeliness of when they can send the transactions. So we do require an 86% system availability per calendar week. And if there's any downtime, those should be noted so the providers know that the system is down. So there's regularly scheduled downtime requirements. There's also notification requirements if the system is going to go down for any non-routine downtime. And if there's any emergency downtime, perhaps there's a bug that needs to be fixed in the system, the applications have to be taken down to be migrated into the fix for the program. So this allows providers and any of your trading partners, for that matter, clearinghouse or software vendors, to understand that there are some limitations on the health plan side or on the clearinghouse side at this moment, at this time, and that you may have some bandwidth issues. You may not receive acknowledgments as you should, but we're letting you know that in advance. So again, these requirements are applicable to all the transactions. On the next slide, you'll see that the Phase 4 companion guide requirements are applicable here too for each of the transactions. And the requirement is, if you are a trading partner and you do publish a companion guide, you must follow the flow and format of the specific template that has been published, and it is available for free on our website. Ensure that all of your trading partners are using basic same format. So they can go find exactly what they need as they're building their systems to ensure that they can conduct the transactions according to their trading partner agreement that they have with that particular health plan or with that clearinghouse. So again, it has a very specific format to it. It ensures, again, consistency across the entire industry on what this particular document looks like and how it should be consumed by the users of such companion guides. On the next slide, as I mentioned before, there are some very unique requirements related to Phase 4. They're specific to the transactions. Again, for the healthcare claim, for example, anyone that receives a 99 transaction or the 277CA transaction within 1 business day of its receipt, you have to be able to process that transaction and do something with it. We don't want to make it just that someone has to send it or generate it. We also want to make sure that it's consumed and used to ensure that the benefits for sending and receiving these particular acknowledgements are actually used, and also to recognize all the error conditions that are passed. So there may be several errors within the 277CA that are noted, and we don't want the systems and the application vendors to just stop after the first one, because the provider really needs the information on all of the errors. They can correct all of the errors in one time and resubmit that claim or resubmit that bill or reprocess that prior authorization request a single time instead of having going back and forth and iterate that and taking up and consuming more time. Some of the other unique benefits are related to the enrollment transactions. Again, these are related to processing the enrollment and benefit information within a specified time frame. So 5 days of receipt of this of the 834 transaction, the health plan should consume and process that data to update their backend systems related to the enrollment data for that particular member. And we also have a similar process requirement of 5 business days for the premium payment to ensure that the premium payment information, the remittance device data for the premium payment is also applied to the backend systems of the health plan within the 5 business days. Again, ensuring that that data is available and is as recent as it possibly can be. If we move into the next slide, you'll see we have a couple of requirements around a particular technology related to how we conduct the transactions. So we look at and we enhance the phase 2 connectivity requirements. Again, we've ensured that there are some technical improvements as well as transaction support improvements to ensure that, again, we're looking at where the industry was, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, to where the industry is now with the support of very specific HTTPS protocols. The internet has changed in a decade, and we're ensuring that with phase 4 that the technology that is supported and required by the rules has been updated as well. One thing that is really key is that the core operating rules do require a safe harbor. So this allows for all trading partners to use at a bare minimum 1 method for connectivity. Now you may go on above and beyond this. You may have hundreds of connections using hundreds of different types of connectivity. But as a safe harbor, the entire industry can gravitate towards one process for that connectivity to conduct all the transactions. Maybe not just HIPAA transactions, but other transactions as well, including the acknowledgments, including attachments, including other types of data that needs to be moved from point A to point B. If we move to the next slide, a little more detail about the safe harbor requirement. Again, trading partners can use different communication methods and different security methods other than what is specified in the rule. But again, as a basis, if everyone supports one common connectivity and one common security method, it allows for an ease of build, right? It allows for industry to gravitate towards that one type of process and can bring everyone along with it. It becomes the foundation for what could be called a national approach for the connectivity. Now, there are very specific security requirements as detailed on the next slide. We'll go over those just quickly just to make sure that you see those. But we ensure that there is required submitter authentication, which is the digital certificates. Username and password has been phased out for this particular rule. Again, this is related to machine-to-machine technology and communication, not an individual user at your desktop. This is machine-to-machine connectivity and does require that digital certificate use. It does have transport security as well. SSL version 3 or TSL 1.1 or higher. This ensures that it is in compliance with any sort of federal regulations, because these are part of some larger national approaches to digital security. Last but not least, on the next slide, we'll look at some of the single digital certificate requirements. Again, as we move away from a username password to a digital certificate, the single submitter authentication method is really helpful because it does ensure that the security is much stronger than just a username password. It does reduce the cost of implementation. Most everyone has already moved to a digital certificate technology with their own laptops, with their own systems. The client certificate-based authentication requires the submitter to access a cryptographic key. Again, this is just a private key that it's to use in public key certificate. So it's a way of ensuring a more refined security process. Again, the digital certificates, they expire and they do need to be renewed. So it does allow for you to renew those on a systematic process in a systematic way. And it also aligns with other clinical initiatives. INHIN, and it also uses SOAP or HVS for clinical data exchanges. So again, seeing the convergence between the clinical data aspects and components of our industry, as well as with the administrative. So again, a way of moving towards a single approach for all types of interactions and exchanges of data. With that, hopefully, I know there's a fast run through of many of our key components of the operating rules. I'll hand it over to Jessica for our first polling question.
Thank you so much, Bob. So for our first polling question, we want to get a feel from our audience which transactions, which phase 4 transactions you currently conduct. This is a check all that apply polling question. So let's go ahead and launch the poll. And please let us know which of these transactions you're using, the 837, 278, 820, or 834. And feel free to mark more than one if you're using more than one. And this will be really helpful for us to get a feel for which transaction phase is most used. So let's give this a couple more seconds, and then we'll share the results with the audience. All right, let's go ahead and share those results. And so, as you can see, the healthcare claims is used almost universally by this audience, and then about 50% are using the prior auth transaction and the enrollment and disenrollment transaction. And then about a third are using the 820. For Bob or Taha, is this anything worth noting based on this polling, or is this what you expected?
This is a great feedback. I think one thing that we hear quite a bit is that many plans don't accept the 278, they don't use the 278 or the prior authorization transaction, or our vendor doesn't support it. But here we have nearly 60% of our respondents saying that they do use the transaction or support the transaction. So that's always good news. To go from anecdote to some real data. And then for the 820, 834, also kind of higher numbers than I expected here as well. So good news, right? As entities consider adopting the phase 4 operating rules, the transactions will fall into a more uniform way of processing those transactions. We'll always help with adoption.
Thank you, Bob. So now we'll go on to our next presentation on voluntary phase 4 course certification. And I'd like to introduce CAQH Core Manager, Taha Anjarwala. Taha?
Thanks, Jessica. So for today's presentation on a core certification, I'll start out by talking about what makes up the certification program unique, highlighting some of the key benefits, and then going into some of the resources that we have to help start your implementation efforts with a phase 4 certification. So as a program, voluntary certification is the gold standard in how a certification program should be developed and administered. And this slide outlines the elements that make core certification stand out. The core certification program is a multi-stakeholder, collaborative, and industry-driven effort that provides benefits from both industry and from an organizational perspective. From an industry perspective, the elements of the certification program, the actual requirements that are necessary for an organization to demonstrate and test conformance to operating rules were developed by an industry group of multi-stakeholder representatives through a transparent process. The requirements of the certification program were put through the same review and voting process that the core operating rules go through. So core certification is the industry deciding for itself what conformance to operating rules actually means. Another great benefit of the certification program is that each certification phase builds off of one another. So as you implement and certify on one phase of the operating rules, so for example, phases 1 through 3, you can actually leverage your past efforts to implement and certify on the subsequent phases of the core operating rules, which we are now at phase 4. Lastly, another key benefit we hear from organizations as to why they pursue certification is to assure conformance with rules and standards. Many of the reasons why an entity gets core certified are based on the idea that there is an objective third-party testing and subsequently provides you whether or not your organization meets the operating rules. So this is a way to find efficiencies and ultimately reduce administrative costs in healthcare. Core certification is kind of like using TurboTax, going to H&R Block or a third-party accountant to help you with your taxes. It's good practice to find somebody outside of your organization to check your work and to make sure you did it right. Core certification acts as that kind of check and balance for operating rules and standards. So moving on to the next slide. We're happy to announce that we, for the year, and for the inception of the core certification program, we've awarded a total of 330 core seals. And with the most recent certifications being awarded to our Phase 4 pioneers, of some who will be hearing from later today. So I'd like to do a shout out to Anna, WorkComp EDI, Pocket Docs, and Texas Medicaid. And looking at the impact of core certification has on the nation's healthcare system and measuring the amount of covered lives that benefit from core certification. For phases 1 and 2, 76% of the commercially insured and 44% of the publicly insured are covered by core certified health plans. And for phase 2, or phase 3, adoption is currently growing with 27% of commercially insured and 25% of publicly insured covered by certified plans. And as adoption grows for phase 4, we will work to monitor and report on its impact to the industry. All in all, this data shows the momentum of certifications in the industry and the increased commitment and mounting success of stakeholders collectively working together to effectively share electronic data in secure and meaningful ways. So on the next slide, I'd like to now dive into some of the resources and implementation that will help you with implementing the operating rules, specifically with phase 4. So a very important resource that CAQH Core offers is the analysis and planning guide. We offer these for every phase, phase 1, 2, 3, and now 4, with separate guides for each phase, and these tools are available for free and on our website. These guides have separate tools within it, so not only can you do a quick assessment where you can do a simple checks of yes or no, identifying general whether or not operating rules apply, such as does my organization do real-time or batch. Further, the guide offers drill-down tools where you can check operating rule requirements line by line, determining whether or not they apply, its business impact, whether or not the technical impact, and helps you identify remediation strategies, such as making software changes, business process changes, or even the need to add an education or communication opportunity within your organization to engage with other departments or possible trading partners. This tool helps you map touch points between systems and business processes to help streamline implementation of the operating rules. One planning tool the guide offers is the stakeholder and business type evaluation form, which helps your organization determine and map operating rule requirements that may apply and impact your company versus whether or not your rule requirements, and you may need to align those with trading partners to implement and remediate. For example, one critical question is to identify whether or not your organization relies on trading partners for connectivity. If the answer is yes, the tool helps you provide direction on how to work and coordinate with your business associates to ensure smooth implementation of operating requirements. Another tool within the analysis and planning guide is the system inventory and impact assessment worksheet. This worksheet helps you identify and inventory your systems impacted by the operating rules, including whether or not you have in-house developed systems, cloud-based systems, off-the-shelf systems, or that you function some sort of system to a third party. The key here is to understand how many of your systems or products are impacted by each operating requirement and understand which vendors you'll need to coordinate with. As you can see, the analysis and planning guide is a valuable resource to utilize as you implement the phase 4 rules. Then moving to the next slide, you can see we have a host of FAQs, over several hundred for each operating rule. These are questions we received from organizations going through the implementation and certification process submitted through our email inbox. And as we see common trends with technical and process-oriented questions, we would then develop these and turn these into FAQs. These FAQs consist of real-world interpretation or assessment questions on the operating rules or certification process, which we have broken down into a question and answer format where you can drill down to a specific topic. We've even added a search function where you can type in a few key terms where you can find relevant FAQs related to your search. Then moving on to the next slide. This slide provides an overview of the Phase 4 certification testing portal, which is designed to build off user and testing experience from past phases. As I mentioned earlier, core certification builds off one another, so as you implement phase 1, 2, and 3, you can leverage your similar experience and the infrastructure rules to kind of test for phase 4 operating rule, the phase 4 transactions covered by the operating rules. So as I mentioned, phases 1 through 4 share a common set of infrastructure requirements, which Bob had kind of gone over earlier. And these apply across each transaction, including requirements around connectivity and security, response time, system availability, companion guide, acknowledgement. Thus, if you implement one phase, you've already created a foundation which will help streamline implementation across remaining phases. So moving on to the next slide, you can see we matched out the best approach your organization can take when implementing and certifying on the phase 4 rules. This approach starts with an assessment and reading of the operating rules themselves, followed by engagement of internal resources to start a project. Next, utilizing the analysis and planning guides that I discussed earlier to map out and identify gaps in remediation strategies by either working internally or with trading partners for coordination. After your systems have been remediated, the next step should be to pursue certification. That way, your organizations can assure, validate, and showcase its efforts, whether with its operating rule implementation. The certification process includes submission of a core pledge to demonstrate your commitment, followed by certification testing to ensure your systems conform to the operating rules, and lastly, application for the core seal. Core staff are available to help you navigate each step of the certification journey. So I believe this is my last slide. So as an outreach effort for this year, CAQH Core has worked to build industry awareness around our core certification enforcement policy. This is due to the large footprint of core certified entities now in the marketplace, and that organizations across the data exchange should be seeing benefits afforded by the operating rules and standards, and we want to ensure that there is ongoing monitoring of compliance in industry by all trading partners. As a component of core certification, the enforcement policy has always existed, and core certified entities must adhere to the certification policies in addition to operating rules and testing requirements in order to become core certified. The enforcement policy applies to core certified entities, including health plans, vendors, clearinghouses, and providers. The policy touches all phases of the operating rules, including the mandated phases 1 through 3, and now the voluntary phase 4 rules. To help organizations orient and navigate themselves through the certification process, we have created a web page with tools and resources to help with engaging in enforcement. As an example, if you believe one of your trading partners is non-compliant with the operating rules, we have a letter template available to help you start a collaborative dialogue with the trading partners to help facilitate remediation efforts. If you have any questions related to core certification or enforcement, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be glad to set up a time to talk to you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Taha. I'll be moderating the next segment of the webinar, which is a panel discussion with our Phase 4 core certification pioneers. First, I'd like to introduce our two panelists from Humana. Amy Peters, who is a process manager, has been with Humana for over 14 years. She started her career in EDI with 5010 implementation and moved into a process manager role responsible for EDI operations. Her current role includes operational oversight for the 270, 275, and 278 EDI transactions. Lisa Savicki, who is operations program manager, has been with Humana over 20 years. She started her career in EDI with 4010 implementation and then moved into a program manager role responsible for 5010 implementation and ICD-10 migration. Her current role includes various compliance central claim processing system projects and future strategic electronic initiatives. Our speaker from PocketDoc is Faye Bienen, who is the Director of EDI Services at PocketDoc. She manages PocketDoc's trading partner relationships with payers and helped establish formal relationships with more than 392 health insurance during her tenure. These are used for digital health plan enrollment management, to check eligibility for health services based on a patient's insurance plan, to pre-authorize specialist referrals, and submit claims as examples. As a core member of the engineering team, Faye has been is involved in documentation, quality assurance, and implementation support. Our final guest panelist from WorkComp EDI is Jennifer Jones, who's a Director of Operations and Support. Jennifer has been in the clearinghouse industry for 12 years, starting in the dental market and spending the past 9 years with WorkComp EDI. Her role includes client implementations, new project development, and standards maintenance. Welcome to all of our panelists. And the first 3 questions I'm going to ask are for our 2 speakers from Humana, Amy and Lisa. So for the 2 of you, what sort of external coordination did you have to undertake as a large health plan working with multiple vendors to complete Phase 4 course certification?
Our coordination was with one vendor who is also the same vendor we've worked with for Phase 1, 2, and 3. We've learned to build upon what we've done in the past to ensure successful testing process. The majority of our coordination was internal. We've worked with our vendor to install the new security protocol.
And so what type of internal coordination did you have to undertake between the departments to ensure successfully completing testing? For example, did you have to coordinate between your claims department and enrollment departments as the Phase 4 transactions touch 2 different spaces?
Humana started discussing and planning for Phase 4 as an organization in 2013. Our certification in 2017 was relatively simple. With any other large-scale project, we assigned a project manager and pulled in all of our subject matter experts for each of the respective transactions and departments and conducted a gap analysis. The stakeholders and the systems vary by transaction, so it was a coordinated effort to pull all the claims, authorizations, and enrollment teams and systems together.
That's good to know, to hear, and I'm sure some of our audience members probably are learning some good tips for their own implementation efforts. And, you know, to those people in the audience who are perhaps thinking about Phase 4 course certification, what would you say to other health plans are the benefits for pursuing Phase 4 course certification?
Sure. Humana believes that being Phase 4 certified, we are showing our commitment to the administrative simplification across the healthcare spectrum, and then also demonstrates our commitment to our providers and business partners. Creating a standardized business process brings value not only to our customers, but also to our members through the delivery and service of healthcare. The Phase 4 operating rules also addresses a couple key infrastructure challenges related to transactions, such as connectivity, processing time, and system availability. But it's also a critical step in reducing that time-consuming phone calls, fax communications in order to obtain the prior authorizations that are needed by the providers to not only give that information, but then also to receive those approvals.
Thank you so much. The next couple questions are I'll be addressing to Faye at PocketDoc. Faye, what value for your provider clients did you see in pursuing Phase 4 course certification?
Sure. Yeah, the value we saw, was similar to what we heard earlier, ensuring that PocketDoc can meet not only our clients' needs but the industry standards. Especially as it relates to claims, we have a commitment to modernize the business of healthcare and reduce the wasteful administrative processes that were mentioned a little bit ago. So that's sort of the part of the initiative for both PocketDoc and our clients.
That's great, Faye. And, from doing a little bit of research on your website and also working with you in the past several years, it's evident that compliance is ingrained into your company culture. So how does the value of compliance integrate with your very innovative business model?
Absolutely. Yeah, compliance is definitely native to everything we do. So we stay on top of all the industry standards, from our technology solutions, our business processes, engineering development, and delivery protocols. So and downstream to our clients. So it's sort of part of what we do at PocketDoc every day, and this is an example of that.
That's great. So while you were going through the phase 4 testing, were there any challenges that you faced compared to the testing of any of the prior phases 1 through 3?
I think the main challenges we faced was more around planning and securing the resources to complete the testing, but that once that was done, the testing was pretty straightforward. So
that's good to hear, Faye, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then the next few questions I'm going to address to WorkComp EDI, Jennifer at WorkComp EDI. So Jennifer, since can you please educate our audience in how your company, WorkComp EDI, interacts with the medical space using the 837 transaction?
Sure. WorkComp EDI functions as an intermediary communications channel between submitters and receivers, the property and casualty market, which incorporates workers' comp, auto, and personal injury and no-fault industries. The organization has spent building over 3,000 pipes between submitters, who in this market could be doctors, hospitals, billing companies, anyone who wishes to send billing outward for reimbursement, and receivers, who could be insurance plans, employers, bill review companies, one who's receiving medical billing, facilitate faster and more efficient communication. WorkComp EDI also works directly and in alignment with vendors as well, practice management software, EMR, EHR companies, clearinghouses, even service vendors, with the goal of providing seamless access to the entire P&C market.
Thank you for sharing that information, Jennifer. And there are, I guess, more similarities than I anticipated hearing from you, as the healthcare space. So traditionally, the CAQH core operating rules have covered healthcare transactions. What kind of value did WorkComp EDI expect to draw from pursuing phase 4 core certification? In other words, what dynamic in your work with health plans and providers led you to your decision to pursue phase 4 certification?
Sure. Our goal as a company is to offer highly flexible solutions to facilitate interconnectivity through all parties of the property and casualty market. We elected to work with CAQH core so that our clients and our training partners know that we maintain the highest level of interoperability achievable. So our CAQH core certification is kind of a pivotal part of the package of accreditations we're pursuing to solidify our firm's commitment to applying industry best practices to security, privacy, disaster recovery, and transaction processing compliance. Really just all in all, these efforts are meant to help our clients know that we're fully committed to being a leader in the P&C market and someone they can trust to be in alignment with their own corporate goals and objectives.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think it's always really helpful to hear from our implementers and hear those, first-person accounts of the value and the challenges, and also get some tips from each other. So we really appreciate all of you taking the time to talk to us today. So this next slide is a summary of the benefits of implementing the phase 4 operating rules. You'll see immediate business process improvements as you apply infrastructure requirements to an additional 4 transactions, reduce time on acknowledgements and verification, and improve customer satisfaction due to improved efficiencies and reduced errors. As always, we're here to help you along in your implementation journey, so feel free to contact us with any questions or clarifications. And now we're going to take a little bit of time to go through our second polling question. So the question is, and we can go ahead and launch it, is your organization planning to pursue voluntary phase 4 core certification? The responses are yes, no, not at this time, and need more information. And this question really is just a way for us to get a little bit of data from our audience so that we can figure out our planning efforts for next year. So let's give this a few more seconds, see if we can get about half the audience to respond, and then we'll go on to our Q&A. All right, so we're close to 50%, so let's give it 5 more seconds, and we'll quickly share the responses and move on to the next segment. So let's go ahead and share the results. And so it looks like we've got about 40% of our audience needing more information. About a quarter of the audience is interested, and the rest of the audience is either a no or a not at this time. So we will follow up with those of you who answered yes and need more information. And for those of you that are not at this time, hope to hear from you in the future. And now we have time for Q&A. I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. So it looks like we have a few connectivity questions in here. So the first question is, can a HIPAA-covered entity or its agent still use connections that are not compliant with the Phase 4 470 connectivity rule? Bob or Taha, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, I can go ahead and answer that. So yes, a HIPAA-covered entity or an agent must support the Phase 4 connectivity rule compliant connections used for the transactions when requested by a trading partner. But at the same time, you can also, even though you support, implement, and adopt the Phase 4 operating rules, you have to use that method, but you can still use alternate methods as well.
Thanks, Taha. So the next question is, do we need to continue to offer MIME as we did in Phase 2 for trading partners when Phase 4 is so focused?
So the answer to that question would be no. The MIME envelope standard has been phased out in Phase 4 since this phase converged on SOAP. However, for Phases 1 through Phases 2 and 3 transactions, the eligibility, claim status, and ERA, server organizations must offer out MIME since that is the Phase 2 connectivity rule requirement.
Thanks, Taha. So we've got a question coming in from a clearinghouse that only does prior authorizations and not the other Phase 4 transactions. So the question is, can they still get Phase 4 certified only for one transaction?
That is definitely a great question. So with the way certification works for vendors and clearinghouses is kind of a little bit different than how it works for health plans and providers. So with vendors and clearinghouses, it's certification is driven to kind of how your particular product or solution is designed. So if you only do the prior authorization transaction, you can just become certified and test on that particular transaction. So the answer to your question would be yes. But I would like to also point out, if you're a health plan or provider, certification is really dependent on kind of whether or not you do all the transactions or none. So there's a little bit of dependency there, but with vendors and clearinghouses, certification is product specific into how that product conducts the transaction.
Great, thanks, Taha. The next question is, do the Phase 4 connectivity rule processing modes have to be implemented for transactions addressed by this rule, even if non-compliant connections are used to conduct these transactions? Bob or Taha?
So the answer to that question is yes. Non-compliant connections must support all payload processing modes, batch and real-time, specified for transactions mentioned in the Phase 4 connectivity rule.
Great. And then I see we have one last question. And the question is, do the Phase 4 connectivity rule payload type have to be implemented for non-compliant connections to the rule?
The answer to that question is no. The Phase 4 payload types specified for the transactions in the Phase 4 connectivity rule do not have to be implemented for non-compliant connections. The CAQH core payload types must be implemented in compliant connections.
So we do have one last question that came in, and it seems like a good one. So how long does it usually take to obtain certification from start to finish, especially if it's just one transaction?
Yeah, so this all really depends on how many resources and kind of where your systems are in its implementation efforts. If you feel that your systems are complying with the operating rules and are kind of, have been fully remediated, then testing, it could take a little less than 30 days, 30 to 60 days, I would say. But it all depends on the number of resources you have on the project and the readiness of your systems. But in short, if you feel confident and you have the resources available for the project, testing won't take too long, as little as 30 days. But if you're not there, it could take up to as long as 6 months. So, it's a wide range, and it all depends on resources and readiness.
Thank you, Taha. So if you do have any further questions, please feel free to contact us via email, and we will be more than happy to respond to you. On the next slide, you'll see some core certification resources that you can access on the e-learning part of our website. These are dashboards and e-learning modules that provide some helpful information for you. On the next slide, we have the next webinars coming up in January and February. We have a webinar on VBP January 11th with a speaker from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovations at CMS. And then on January 18th, we'll have another technical webinar on attachments, the CDA clinical content. So we hope that you will register with us. And on the next slide, just thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us as well. And as a reminder, there are many benefits to becoming a CAQH core participating organization. Representing your organization with others from around the industry to help the CAQH core mission of creating healthcare operating rules that support standards, accelerate interoperability, and align administrative and clinical activities among providers, payers, and consumers. So if you're interested in becoming a core participant, please contact us. And with that, thank you again, and happy holidays.